Hey gang, Voltie here and welcome back to the classroom. Today I'm going to be talking about the statistical analysis spreadsheets that you might have seen in some previous videos and articles. Basically, I broke down the data from some of the bigger 7-point Highlander events from last year. I then put that into a spreadsheet to generate some data and some numbers to work out what was doing well and what wasn't, and then posted the whole spreadsheet so that you could have a look and make sure that you could see everything, and if I missed anything, you could have it visible. What I'm going to be talking about today is how to read the spreadsheet, how to use it, and if you would like, you can simply copy the whole spreadsheet and make a new one, and you can put in any subset of data that you would like for an event that hasn't been covered by me, for example, and generate your own data sources. So going through the spreadsheet, there's quite a lot of tabs, and I'll touch on each of them as relevant. But first things first, you'll land on a page called the user manual. This is basically a quick instruction guide on what people can do if they want to input their data to generate their own sheet. So for input, you need to be putting in the top 8 decks, the winning decks, and the other decks into those tabs. Every other tab will be locked by default, so you won't be able to add or generate any data in them. The reason for that is the bulk of those sheets generate numbers based on formula from the data sheets that you're putting in. So here you can see the top 8 decks sheet. It's very simple. You'll put the match totals at the end of Swiss in the yellow line. You'll put the names in the red line, but that ultimately doesn't affect any of the data. And then you'll need to put in the main deck. There is room for up to 80 cards in case someone is playing Yorion. And then you'll need to make sure that the sideboard lines up with the sideboard row here. And the reason for that is that these cards need to be distinguished as sideboard cards because of where they need to end up. Winning decks and other decks are exactly the same. You'll see that there's gaps here in between the main deck and the sideboard. If someone decides to register Battle of Wits in a major event, that's something that I will handle should it be appropriate, but by default it allows for 80 cards because that's the most realistic high-end for main decks. Next we'll get onto the conversions sheet. Now this is the first sheet of the spreadsheet that will have generated data. So here it is divided into 2 categories, one for pointed cards and one for all cards, delineated by the green columns. Any card that has a number in the top 8 count will generate data based on its conversion and conversion factor. Any number that didn't show up in top 8 at all will not be able to generate that data because it didn't convert into top 8, and therefore we can't see how well it did in the top 8. For the winning decks conversion, there's usually more cards that will show up, and we can get a bit of information. The columns themselves are simple. The cards will be listed here that are present on the points list. The top 8 count will be how many copies that showed up. The conversion will be how many copies showed up in top 8 out of the total number of copies in the room. And then conversion factor is the important one. Now, when I say the conversion factor is the important one, that's because if there are 8 copies of a card in top 8, so say every single player in top 8 registered Force of Will, but there were 20 copies in the room, the conversion rate would only be 40%. The conversion factor, however, would be maximized because... So the way the conversion factor works is that the more copies are in a tournament of a card, the more that are expected to be in top 8 or in winning decks in terms of the breakpoints there. And the better or worse the actual number is compared to the expected number, the better or worse the conversion factor is. So if every single person in a room registers the same pointed card, then the conversion will be 8 out of the total entrants, but the conversion factor will end up being exactly 1. that's because it is expected that everyone in top 8 will have a copy of the card because everyone in the room has the card, and then in actual fact there'll be 8 copies, so it'll match up to 1. So in terms of this column, the further away the conversion factor is from 1, the better or worse the card performed. So in this case, there weren't that many copies of Vampiric Tutor in the room, but they all did really well, which means the conversion factor is really, really high. It wasn't expected to have 2 copies of Vampiric Tutor in top 8. It was likely closer to 0.6, for example, but because there were 2 copies, it did much better than expected. For the winning deck conversion, this is the same function, it's the same formula. However, the minimum requirement to be met is different. So in this case, it is expected that more cards will be present within the winning decks out of the total number of copies, and therefore the better or worse something can do will be shrunk. It's hard to do really, really, really well when it's an easier bar to cross. For all cards, it's the same thing. One thing of note when reading the sheet is that it is very common for there to be several cards that have 1 copy with 100% conversion and a maximized conversion factor. This is because we get small sample sizes for 7-point Highlander decks, and on top of that, each card is a singleton, so you're more likely to see single copies of cards in a room do well. So the real point of the all cards section is to sift through the data and find cards that performed better than expected with a large number of copies. So Consigned to Memory is the big example here. There were 4 copies in the top 8, but it still did 2.96 as a conversion factor, which means there weren't as many Consigned to Memories in the room to generate an expected number of, say, 3.1 consigns in top 8, but there were actually 4, so it did much better than expected. And then it follows on as well, so we have winning deck conversions as well, which with the larger amount. Match point average, this tab says what it is on the tin. So in the main board, you'll see every single card that is present in deck lists. It will then be organized in descending value by the average match points. So in this case, there was 1 copy of Gaia Reach Sanitarium. It got 18 points. That means it did very well, and it had an average match point percentage of 18. So the more copies of cards there are in the room, the more likely the average is to stabilize somewhere in the middle ground. So again, the point is to sift through and determine what you're looking for. And then there are also a sideboard delineation and a pointed cards delineation as well. So in this case, we can see that Mishra's Workshop had the highest match point average out of all the pointed cards. And that's because quite a few of the bots decks and shop decks did very well over the course of that event. For total deck points, this essentially just tells you how many copies of cards that are on the points list were played in the room, as well as how many points were spent, and that's what these 2 sections are for. So on the left, it's purely based off the number of copies. In this case, Falsa Will was the most played pointed card, but then on the right, we can see that more points were spent on Time Walk than on Falsa Will. Even though there are only 6 copies, each of those are worth 5 points, and so we can generate 2 subsets there. And the last 3 columns are to show you where those pointed cards are, or where they are present. For total decks or cards, this is how you can find out the most commonly played cards and where they were. So it'll rank it alphabetically in the yellow column, and then in descending by number in the pink column. It also separates between mainboard and sideboard. This particular sheet is mainly to find out what people are playing a lot of, and what general metagame shifts there are. For top 8 points, this will show you the total number of pointed cards in the top 8, as well as the point buy spent on them. So in this case, there were 2 copies of Vampiric Tutor, so it had the highest point buy in top 8, but Force of Will was at 5 copies with a point buy of 5 in the other pink column. For top 8 all cards, this has a very similar sheet. And again, the next couple of sheets are all just automatically generated subsets of data based off the deck lists that are put into the sheet to tell you generally what aggregate cards are being played. The all list RL sheet, you won't have to check this realistically. The yellow column is labeling every single card that is on the reserve list, and the pink column shows you how many of them were in the room. So in this case, Tropical Island, Underground Sea, Bayou, Volcanic Island, and Badlands were the 5 most played RL cards, and you'll usually just check this sheet, sift down to the first non-dual land card, and we can see here that Null Rod was the most played reserve list card that wasn't a dual land. This is the points list. You realistically won't have to check this. However, if you copy the sheet, you'll need to manually update this if there are points changes. This is where all of the decks show up. These get moved and migrated from the individual deck list sheets. And then we have these 2 sheets, which are purely functional. There isn't any inputted data required. But for your information, any card that appears will have any card that appears will have the match points associated with it. So in this case, the first deck in the all decks matrix got 17 points, which means every single card that was in that deck will earn 17 points here in this column. And then the next deck over has 15, and each of those will be listed there as well. And this is just used for the mathematics in terms of working out match point averages. So that's it. That's how this sheet works. If at any point in time I released a stats article, there will be a sheet of the data from that event within the comments of YouTube or in the article if it's on the 7 Point website. If you click on that sheet, this guide will hopefully help you to read that and pass the data and know exactly what you're looking at there. But otherwise, I encourage you to give this a shot. If you want, you can put in any kind of event that you have records for just to see what happened and see if you understand how the sheet works. And if you have any questions, you can pop them in the comments down below. But otherwise, this video was brought to you with the help and support of my lovely patrons and donors. If you have the ability to financially support the content and the channel and you would like to, there are links down below to the Patreon, as well as a PayPal donation link if you would like. Otherwise, if you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. It's free, it doesn't cost you anything, and it helps with my metrics. I'm looking to grow the channel and ensure that each of my videos that I upload are reaching the appropriate audience. But otherwise, that's it from me. Voltie out.